right, thank you for tuning in. 6 minutes after 10 o'clock, and it's been a good show so far this morning. You know, once in a while we get into the nitty-gritty of politics on this show, and I think you're going to like this next conversation. David Schultz is waiting to speak to us. He has credentials, Robin, that go everywhere. He's been on every show. It's such an honor to be able to say he is on our show. He is a professor in the Hamline University Graduate School of Management. He's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Time Magazine, Radio Free Europe. Wow, I haven't even heard that name in a while. MSNBC, ABC, CBS, The Today Show, Newsweek. It goes on and on and on and on. And now he can add to that AM Ocala Live, which we're proud to say. He's been with us. He's on the phone. His book is called Election Law and Democratic Theory. Election Law, Politics, and Theory. David Schultz, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thank you for being on the air with us. It sounds like there's a delay. Oh, gosh, I hope that's not a problem. Where are you right now?
I am in St. Paul, Minnesota, where you're probably envious of the fact that it is 10 degrees.
Well, sometimes I am envious. You know, this past winter when we didn't have any snow, it was kind of, yeah, I was kind of jealous to hear people. Do you have snow on the ground right now?
We do, and potentially we're supposed to get another snowstorm later this week. Yeah, we've gone from about having 3 feet on the ground to maybe just about a foot on the ground right now, so not too bad.
So, yeah, we kind of missed that. Robin is originally from Wisconsin, so...
Yeah, go Packers.
She misses it, too. So we are continually, whenever politics is a topic at hand, especially after an election, or maybe as we get close to an election and somebody looks like they're going to lose, like your favorite candidate's going to lose. In the presidential campaign, this would be. The Electoral College is always debated. So should we start there? I mean, is that part of what the book is about? I don't know if I should go there or not.
Well, let me sort of tell you where I think the book takes its premise from. And it takes the premise from what happened in Florida in your state back in 2000.
Okay.
And it's all about Bush v. Gore. And I say that because prior to Bush v. Gore and all the litigation and eventually the Supreme Court decision, no one ever thought about election law and thought about the rules that structure our elections, who gets on the ballot, all the different questions that seem to have surfaced. And the reason why I say that becomes important now for the 2000 is that, you know, in the last now 14 years, we're much more conscious of the fact that our entire election system is held together by rules. And what increasingly is happening is that for people to try to affect the outcome of elections, they don't just wait till elections occur and then sue afterwards, but they now pass laws or sue beforehand, and to try to use the election law rules and to use the courts in a way to try to affect or maybe structure the eventual outcome of the elections. And so what my book talks all about is across a whole bunch of different areas of election law, anywhere from money in politics to ballot access to right to vote to things like initiative and referendum. It really talks all about how the rules really determine the outcome of elections. I remember many years ago having a conversation with Archibald Cox, former special prosecutor in Watergate, and was the head of Common Cause, and he once said that election law are the rules that determine the rules of the game. And I always like that description, and that's what the book is about. It's discussing the rules that determine the rules of the game.
Okay, now I have a question, and if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of ask two at once. So here's the first one of the two. The first one is, do the rules that you just referred to stem from something in the Constitution? Is there a foundation in the Constitution for the rules that we use in our elections, in voting for somebody? And then part two is that I was always under the impression that in George Washington's time, there were no political parties. And I always thought that if I went to the election booth and didn't know if there was an R or a D next to a guy's name, that I would be forced to have to know something about the guy's position rather than just say, oh, I'm on this team, I'm going to vote for the guy on my team. So did that kind of skew the whole thing when we decided to separate ourselves into different parties?
Well, clearly George Washington himself, I'll answer that question first. Washington himself clearly was fearful of the rise of parties, and his inaugural speech really sort of talked all about the dangers that political parties would bring to the United States in terms of how would they divide us. And in some sense, you know, depending on your perspective, he's become rather prescient in terms of describing where we are in American politics now, in terms of whether we call it the red and blue America or whatever it is. And so, on one level, yes, on one level, there's people who argue that the two-party system, at least the way it's constituted right now, really divides us. But a lot of political scientists will argue and say that were it not for political parties, governance would be impossible, that it would be difficult for us to form majorities, it'd be difficult for Congress to get its work done. And so parties, like a lot of things in American politics, parties, let us say interest groups, have a dual-edged sword. Parties are great when they do what they're supposed to do, horrible when they divide us. Interest groups, we always say, we hate those special interest groups, except, of course, when we're the groups that we're members of. But so parties become one of those interesting groups in our political system that do have, I would argue, some constitutional foundation, as do some of our election law rules. And that sort of comes back to your first question here. Right. Is that in some ways, some of the rules of the game are determined by the Constitution. How we elect the President of the United States, for example, with the Electoral College, is clearly specified in the Constitution. The structure of our Congress in terms of every state getting 2 senators, at least 1 member of the House of Representatives, things like that. But when we get to something more fundamental, for example, in terms of the right to vote, I always point out to people that nowhere in the text of the Constitution, in the original Constitution, or even in the amendments, do we have an explicit right to vote. Original Constitution is silent on the whole matter. Supreme Court has had to basically find a right to vote within the Constitution. And then even all the amendments that grant women the right to vote, freed slaves the right to vote, 18-year-olds, are phrased in the negative. They say, no law shall be passed that denies individuals the right to vote on account of sex or race or age. And so on one level, the rules about eligibility to vote are to a large extent determined by Congress and, more importantly, by state legislatures, and then issues, again, such as ballot access, who's entitled to be on the ballot, are also issues that are significantly left up to states to make a determination. And so to a large extent, the Constitution is relatively silent. And the subtitle of my book, or the part 2 of the title of my book, Election Law and Democratic Theory, really tries to say that what we need to be thinking about is, if we're trying to promote a democracy, what do we mean by a democracy? And B, how do some basic democratic values, such about equality of opportunity, liberty, transparency, things like that, concepts like that, how do they or should they inform or influence our laws and, more importantly, our court decisions? Because one of the things that I've been concerned about, and I'm not the only person to make this argument, is that over about a 25, 30, 40-year period since the courts have really gotten heavily involved in elections, is that there seems to be sort of no rhyme or reason in terms of oftentimes their decisions, and it's partly because there may not be any kind of overarching set of principles or values structuring what they're doing.
And there are so many things, too, and I don't expect you to answer everyone in this short radio interview, but I'm wondering if in the book you address them, and those are things like the districts that are drawn. Here in Florida, we have this big issue about they call gerrymandering the lines, so that we have a district that runs literally 300, no, maybe not 300, maybe 200 miles, like a tiny narrow corridor. Some people say it's a good thing, some people say, but my question is not whether it's good or bad, but whether it's actually addressed in the book. That kind of stuff, plus also whether a person should have a legal ID in order to vote, stuff like that you hear in the news all the time.
Sure. Okay, I do address both of them. Let's talk about the gerrymandering issue. Is that clearly, it's been around since the very early days of the American Constitution, and I think part of the fundamental problem, if we're looking at it, is there's 2 problems with it. One is that we want to have one person, one vote. There's no question about that. We also want to say we want to have districts that are compact, contiguous, just seem to have some kind of meaningfulness sense in terms of, how they represent an area. But at the same time, the courts have said, we should be able to also consider other variables, such as, for example, communities of interest. We don't want to break up local subunits of government. The point is that there's a lot of competing values that go into trying to figure out how to draw lines. Having said that, though, that to say that we've got to figure out how to navigate all of those, I make an argument in my book and say that it's fundamentally a conflict of interest to let legislators draw their own district line. I mean,
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about it, we're supposed to pick our elected officials. The elected officials are not supposed to pick their voters, and that's increasingly what's happening in this country. But the other complication is with this is what some people have talked about is the big sort. And the big sort is the fact that we increasingly sort ourselves out geographically according to our political values, that we like to live next to other people who share similar political views. And therefore, we can look at maps in the United States in terms of areas that are Democrat versus Republican, for example, and find that they're concentrated. And so even if we can get rid of gerrymandering, and somehow say, okay, we're going to turn it over to some, nonpartisan or multi-partisan, whatever you want to call it, redistricting commission. We have to deal with the reality that we've sorted ourselves out. So well politically that it might still be hard to draw some lines if we want to create competitive districts. And one of the problems that we're facing in Congress right now, this fall, 435 seats up for election. The best estimates are that between gerrymandering and sort of political geographic sorting, there's less than 50 seats in the country that are competitive, that could swing from one party to another, maybe even less. And so we pretty much know going into this election that roughly 90% of the seats are safe.
It's going to be same old. So let me just tell you a philosophical thought I've had on this, and okay. It might not be addressed in the book, and so just give me a second if we're veering from the topic at hand, which is your book. I want to be fair to the book, but just because you bring something up that I want to address, it's this. We had a game one time on the show that we do, Robin and I do, and the game was pretty simple. We said, what would the world be like if everybody had my tastes? And if everybody had Robin's taste? If everybody had my tastes, guess what? There'd be no coffee ice cream. Guess what? There'd probably be no I don't know, there'd be no ping pong. I'm not a big ping pong fan, all right? There'd probably be no Volkswagens because, I'm never going to buy one, okay?
Right.
And Miley Cyrus would probably be washing dishes, okay?
Yeah.
So what that has to do with...
So far, I'm in agreement with you, by the
way. Okay, but the reason that the application of that thought to this is that while I have my political viewpoint, I thank God that there's somebody who thinks differently. Let's say, for example, that everybody thought extreme right. Guess what? There'd be no libraries.
Right.
Guess what? There'd be no sidewalks.
Exactly.
There wouldn't be a whole lot of public schools. But if everybody thought extreme left, and I'm using extremes just for the sake of illustration, by the way, if everybody thought extreme left, we might be communist.
Yeah.
Okay? And you could argue that. But my point is that thank God we have each other. It's kind of like having, two parents in the household. One is the nice mom who answers the door friendly, and the other one is the strong dad who tells the guy at the door to go away. It's good that you have both, right?
Right. I agree. And I think we do have both in the United States. The problem is that the both aren't meeting somewhere where they have to negotiate.
That is the problem. Absolutely. Yes.
And that's exactly the issue that I'm hitting at here, is that when we have, go back to my congressional example, when we only have about 50 seats in the country where our swing, where you as a legislator have to say, my gosh, I just can't pander to one side. I've got to listen and figure out how to negotiate out. That's not good, because what we have in Congress, I'm just going to make up some rough numbers here and say roughly about 220 solid Republican, probably roughly somewhere around, 180, 190, solid Democrat. My math's off a little bit, pardon me. But we roughly have that. These are seats where they don't have to negotiate, because you've got constituents back home saying, go off there and, to use your example, vote for no more sidewalks, vote for no more, no more public schools.
Right.
got a bunch on the other side voting and saying, go after, and tax the hell out of those corporations and rich people, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, the only fear that in those two different districts we have is that if I don't take a hard enough line position, I'm going to get challenged from either the far left or the far right. That's exactly what we're seeing in this country right now, is that across the country, I mean, think about a place like Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, who by any consideration, Senate Minority Leader, is conservative. He's being criticized by his own party as not conservative enough, and it's being challenged from the right. Chambliss in Mississippi is facing the same thing. And so what we do want to create, and we don't have that right now, because of redistricting or gerrymandering, and because of the big sort, we don't have that scenario where we have to force people to actually confront and listen to opposing sides. One of my teachers many years ago said, we live in a noisy democracy. Lots of us talk, but few of us listen. And I always remember that, and I think it's absolutely correct.
That is correct. And let me just apply it to the Florida governor race as it looks right now. Because Charlie Crist, I hope you know who he is. He was the governor.
I do.
He was the governor. He was Republican. He's now a Democrat. And guess what? He hasn't changed. My thinking is this, that he changed parties, but he hasn't changed. He was always somewhat moderate. He was always moderate when he was a Republican. He was never extreme. He was always moderate. Now he's with the Democrats. And what I said in the beginning about if we had no parties, then every voter would have to think about the candidate more than the party. Charlie Crist is a perfect example, because anybody who voted for him when he was a Republican and believed in what he stood for then would also vote for him now that he's a Democrat, because he's still the same guy. He's still got the same beliefs, but now he has a D next to his name. So there are some people who will vote for him because he is who he is, and there are other people who will say, oh, there's my D, that's who I vote for. But last time they wouldn't vote for him.
Mm-hmm. I think we lost him. Here he comes. He came back.
Oh.
Call him back.
My goodness, we lost you. It sounds like
we lost. I'm back.
How far did I get before we lost you?
You got into Charlie Crist, and he hasn't changed.
Right, and so just so whatever you missed, I wanted to say that the voter who voted for him before when he was a Republican, if you're voting for the man and his principles, you should also vote for him now, because the man and his principles are the same. But that's kind of what I was trying to illustrate in the beginning, is that the D and the R often influence the voters who kind of are the complacent voter or the apathetic voter. It's like, oh, there's my D, there's my R.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
I do. And sometimes, again, the labels do communicate something, and sometimes the labels sort of stand in the way of voters actually,
Did we lose him?
No, he should still be there.
Are you still there, David? Some phone issues. The light says he's still there, but I don't hear him. No, he's gone again. I don't know what it is. David Schultz is our guest. His book is called... David, I don't know what's happening. Are you there now?
I'm there now. I don't know what's happening. We keep losing one another. Okay, I can pick up right where I was.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The challenge, is that the labels, don't always, stand in or help us in terms of understanding, but they sort of hide us from doing the real work that we need to do. With my students, for example, I talk to my law students, more importantly, my undergraduate students, where I'm teaching American politics this semester, and I sometimes kid with them, and I say, do you think that we really ought to bring back the literacy tests in the sense of requiring that people demonstrate and know something about the political process? Now, understanding the fact that the literacy test had a historical purpose in terms of, discrimination, a lot of my students will say that they don't vote because they don't know enough about the system, and they sometimes wonder and say, well, should we have a higher threshold? I think one of my students, who's a naturalized citizen, pointed out and said that he probably had to know more about the American political system to become a citizen than probably the average American does. And there's an interesting point to be brought up there. But clearly there's no question that in many situations, we are voting straight on label and not really thinking about what the candidates are supporting. And that's a danger. That's clearly a danger.
That's my point. That is my point.
People may be voting against what's their real interests or what they really want. I mean, if we look at public opinion polls in the United States right now, I mean, just pick at the presidential level. I mean, Barack Obama's approval rating is not very good. You know, it's in the low 40s. But if you ask the American public the questions about where they stand on a variety of issues, you know, they strongly support a lot of his positions. Or the best routine was, you might remember a few months ago on Jimmy Fallon, where he went out and asked people what they thought of the Affordable Care Act. Overwhelmingly, they hated him. But then he asked them what they thought all about. No, they liked the Affordable Care Act, but when they asked him what they thought about the Obamacare, they overwhelmingly hated it.
Oh, goodness. Oh, no. Oh, no.
The label stood in the way of how people were judging a matter.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty sad.
You have so many people that will say, well, we need a third party. And then by the time the elections come around, that third party isn't there. You've got all of these other, 13,000 third parties, but nobody is really rallying to get a third party. How can you help them get one strong third party, or just throw that third party out the window altogether and stop saying that?
Well, there's two problems here. First is in terms of how difficult it is for a third party to form. And one of the things to remember is that the rules regarding ballot access for parties are written by whom? The Democrats and the Republicans. And so they're not exactly making it easy for third parties to form in the United States. And in many states, for example, in New York State, the boards of elections are composed of members of the two major parties. They're not going to be too sympathetic to thirds. And so, first off, the rules are stacked against third parties. Second, there really is, because of this almost entrenchment of the two parties, almost the entry costs of getting into the race, to being able to raise the money and to convince people, more importantly, to convince people that you're viable is really difficult, because a lot of people, again, this comes back to Florida 2000, and it comes back to the Nader example. You know, many people blame Ralph Nader for why Al Gore didn't eventually win the state and win the presidency. And what it leaves people with is sort of the spoiler taste. They say, boy, Nader was really my first choice, but if I vote for him, my worst choice, that is, George Bush, gets elected. And so now people look at third parties and say, gosh, I really would like to vote for that third party candidate, but if I do, then what might happen is my worst choice, a Democrat or Republican, gets elected. And so our rules right now make it difficult for third parties to really succeed. And the third sort of reason is the enormous costs. When we think about, in recent history, the most successful third-party candidates, Ross Perot, for example, back in the 90s, and I'm not sure what I call him now, but Mayor Bloomberg in New York. I mean, these are billionaires, individuals who can basically self-finance their own campaigns. And I don't know about you, I am not too thrilled about the idea of rule by billionaires, in the sense that, you know, they can basically have an advantage in the political system because they're worth $1 billion.
Oh, yeah. It seems to me that most third parties are occupied by former Republicans, more so than former Democrats, although I'm sure there's some examples of that. That's what it seems like to me when we have them in the studio. Usually we say, well, what party did you leave? They left the Republican Party to become a Reform Party or a Constitution Party or something like that. And I don't remember what Ralph Nader, he was the Green Party?
I think so.
He was the Green Party, correct.
He was the Green
Party. But I was going to say, but Green Party, but Governor Christ, Charlie Crist is the best example where you have at this point, is that while clearly the two major parties have both moved in different directions. They've moved from being parties with moderates and liberals and conservatives within them. The Republicans have clearly moved further to the right, and individuals such as Charlie Crist, for example, probably has no place within the Republican Party, because the party has moved so far to the right. Again, I think in terms of over time, other notable Republicans who would never find a place in the party again. John Anderson in 1980 moves away from the Republican Party, runs as a third-party candidate. I think of, again, go back to New York where I grew up, people such as Nelson Rockefeller clearly, would have no place within the Republican Party now. And so the Republican Party has clearly shifted more to the right than the Democrats have to the left. What we've really seen is the two parties become more European style in the sense of being more ideological and less sort of, again, coalitional. And And therefore, what we now have also is the sense in which, especially in the South, is the disappearance of Democrats from the South. In terms of, it went from solidly Democrat to solidly Republican. You can't really find, the old, Southern Democrats in the Democratic Party anymore. There's this great story I like to tell in my book, just in terms of how the political structure of America has changed, and that in 2004, when John Kerry ran for president against George Bush, John Kerry won the exact same states that Abraham Lincoln won in 1864.
Oh, that is interesting, yeah. But you know what? I know we're out of time, but the average person that I know is not defined by the party that they are a member of. I don't know one Democrat or one Republican who is as extreme as the media makes them out to be, in both cases. I really do think that if the party is the people in the party, then the illusion that the Republican Party has gone extreme right or the Democratic Party has gone extreme left is just that. It's an illusion. And I don't know who's perpetrating it. I don't know if it's us in the media, especially radio hosts. I think we are. Maybe not you and I, Robin, but I think a lot of our colleagues who are on the bigger shows tend to drift to one side or another. If you just study how to be a talk show host and be successful, that's what they'll say. They'll say you have to be opinionated to the extreme if you want to be successful. And then that's left as well as right, except it didn't work out for Al Franken. It's just, but I think it could. A very invigorating conversation, David. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's called Election Law and Democratic Theory. David Schultz, you've given us a great interview. How do we get the book?
Best way to do it is to go to the Amazon.coms and BarnesandNobles.coms of the world, and that's the best place to do it. Okay.
And do you have a website of your own?
I would just say go to Schultz'sTakeBlogspot.com, and it's my blog, and also I have a website there which talks about the book.
Well, again, it's an honor to have you on our show, David. Thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today.
No problem. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Good one. We'll take a little break. We'll be right back.
Legally Yours, brought to you by Fuller & Fuller Attorneys at Law. On the air every Wednesday morning at 10:30 a.m. with John Fuller, a board-certified civil trial lawyer for over 25 years. John welcomes your questions, from business to complex family matters to legal disputes. So tune in every Wednesday morning at 10:30 a.m. for Legally Yours with John Fuller, right here on WOCA 1370 AM and 96.3 FM, The Source.
Gene Powell Past Chamoyne.